think that anybody that has any interest in nature and natural history has at some time been inspired by Charles Darwin and what he found during his visit to the Galapagos Islands. I certainly was. This is a strange, beautiful, remarkable place. The word unique absolutely applies here. There are so many creatures that exist nowhere else on Earth. The proximity of these animals, the degree to which they lack fear, that you can just stand next to them and they just look at you or ignore you, is unlike anything anywhere in the world. It will never leave you if you go to the Galapagos Islands. You will have stories for the rest of your life, I promise you. Since my first visit to the Galapagos Islands in 1966, and I remember vividly the first time I went there, how extraordinary it was, how surprised I was, how delighted I was at more or less everything I saw. Every single time I've been to this extraordinary place, it amazes me. It's the most remarkable place on Earth. I believe that we offer a really, really compelling and interesting way to go there for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that we've been doing this for a very long time, back since 1966. And so we have come to understand the islands, understand the opportunities, understand what people are looking for, I believe perhaps better than anybody out there.
I just really like to see how the funds provided by Lindblad National Geographic is enabling us to work with the park and with other organizations, and just seeing how tourism is really benefiting the work of these institutions and how it's integrated into the society here in Galapagos.
Fully a third of the Galapagos Marine Reserve was declared a no-take zone, meaning that there is no extraction of any kind. This is huge from the perspective of creating really, really significant resilience in the marine system. So we're engaged on a multitude of fronts. So we partner with a multitude of organizations to try and ensure that there is significant impact as to the needs that exist here. And there are many, and they will be many in the years to come. And we want to be front and center in helping them figure out how to best conserve these islands, give them the right kind of protection, work with the human communities so that they have the opportunity to thrive here in the islands that they call home.
Hello, and welcome to this panel discussion on international policies and communities as part of the Capitol Hill Oceans Week 2021. My name is Nathan Bennett, and I'm the chair of the People in the Ocean Specialist Group for the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the founder and principal investigator of the People Seas Initiative, and an independent consultant. Through these initiatives and my consulting work, I focus on advancing thinking and policy solutions related to the human dimensions of fisheries, marine protected areas, coastal community adaptation, and the blue economy. Before I go any further, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional and unceded lands and ocean territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nation. This is also known as Vancouver, Canada. This explicit recognition of the people in the places where we work is really important as we engage in discussions about conservation as well as management of the oceans. So we all know that the oceans are on the global agenda. Oceans have become a key touch point in deliberations and policies related to sustainable development, climate change, as well as conservation. But where are Indigenous peoples and local communities within these discussions and policy documents? There are an estimated 600 million people living on the coasts. More than 775 million people are highly dependent on the oceans for food. There are also as many as 200 million people working across the fishery sector globally, and it is estimated that as much as 90% of all of the jobs in the fishery sector are related to artisanal and small-scale fisheries. In short, Indigenous peoples and coastal communities around the world are highly reliant on the oceans and also deeply culturally connected to these spaces. Indeed, many global agreements and policy platforms advocate for consideration of the rights, needs, and equitable treatment of Indigenous peoples and local communities. For example, this includes the Paris Agreement, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and the Convention on Biological Diversity. But do these agreements go far enough? Are the recommendations contained in these international policy documents influencing conservation actions across the world's oceans? What impacts are the social principles contained in these platforms having on the ocean policies and actions being taken by national governments? Furthermore, how well do global ocean policy platforms and deliberations make space for the voices of Indigenous peoples and local communities and account for their needs and perspectives in the formulation of global policy? This panel discussion will focus on these questions, on this interplay between global ocean policy and the people of the oceans. Finally, I want to give you a very brief introduction to each of our very accomplished and engaged speakers. Of course, I will not be able to do them justice in a couple of sentences, so please refer to their bios on the Capitol Hill Oceans website for more information. First of all, Queen Quet is the Chieftess and head of state for the Gullah Geechee Nation and founder of the Gullah Geechee Sea Island Coalition. She is also a published author, computer scientist, lecturer, mathematician, historian, columnist, preservationist, environmental justice advocate, environmentalist, film consultant, and an artivist. Queen Quet has engaged and represented her nation both nationally and internationally, including at the United Nations COP22 and COP25 climate change conferences, and at the United Nations Ocean Action Summit in Korea. Sophia Kiani is an Iranian-American climate activist and the founder and executive director of Climate Cardinals, an international nonprofit with 8,000 volunteers in 40-plus countries working to translate climate information into 100 languages. She has been named Vice Media's Youngest Human of the Year, Uniday's Student Woman of the Year, and BuzzFeed's Youngest Woman to Watch. She also represents the U.S. as the youngest representative on the inaugural United Nations Youth Advocacy Group on Climate Change. Our third panelist is Nisreen El-Saim, who is the chair of the United Nations Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change, a general coordinator for Youth and Environment Sudan, and chair of Sudan Youth Organization on Climate Change. Through these and other organizations, Nisreen has organized and mentored large numbers of young people to give them the regional and international networking opportunities and platforms that they need. Nisreen El-Saim has also written numerous policy papers on climate change, renewable energy, gender, and youth empowerment. And then last but not least is Cheryl Ann Maltese, who's serving her fourth term as the chairwoman of the Wampanoag tribe of Gayhead-Aquina. Before being reelected as the chairwoman, Cheryl Ann Andrews Maltese completed a presidential appointment in Washington for the Obama administration as the first tribal leader to become a senior advisor to the Secretary of Indian Affairs. She also serves on numerous tribal and national advisory councils related to a diverse portfolio of issues, ranging from federal recognition to tribal self-governance to historic preservation and sacred sites protections to the Indian Child Welfare Act regulations to tribal consultations to domestic and international issues on women's rights and protections to international repatriation. To be honest, I feel somewhat out of my depth among this incredible group of women. Fortunately, it is just my job to ask the questions and to facilitate a really good conversation. But first, just to get the conversation rolling, I want to ground us in the places and communities that we are going to be talking about, just by asking, why is this important? Why is it important to build inclusion, equity, and justice for Indigenous peoples and local communities into international ocean policy discussions? Please speak from your own perspectives or from the perspective of the communities that you represent. And Cheryl, maybe we'll start with you with this question.
Certainly, and thank you, Nathan, and welcome everybody. It's truly a privilege and an honor to be part of this forum. My name is Cheryl Andrews Maltese, and I'm the chairwoman of the Wampanoag tribe of Gayhead-Aquina. We're also known as the people of the first light. We're from the island of Nopi, which is now known as Martha's Vineyard, and we're an ocean-going peoples, and we've been known whalers, and we still remain in our Aboriginal ancestral territory, which we have lived in since time immemorial. The reason that these policies and these international policies are so important is because they affect not only the governments of the people who are engaged and agree to these policies and the mainstream citizens, but the dramatic impact is from the Indigenous peoples. From our standpoint, we had one instance where there was an industrial wind farm that was being proposed for outside of our territory. And while this had a greater good perspective on what it was going to do for the American people, it had a detrimental effect on our cultural sites, our sacred sites, and our ability to have our spiritual connection with who we are as a people, as Indigenous peoples. So we were able to work with that and work through that. However, when you have policies that do impact Indigenous peoples, it is critical that we are all there at the table, having our opportunity to be part of the deliberations and the decision making at the early stages, and ensuring that the Indigenous peoples have the same voice and vote and ability to agree and consent before any of these policies are enacted, or else these injustices will still continue and our voices of Indigenous peoples will not be heard.
Thank you for really providing us with a nice context. Queen Quet, would you care to build on this question?
I absolutely would. Thank you for having me. I'm so glad for day with all the strong woman and thing like that. And glad that one of the day we need to guide this conversation. So I'm Queen Quet, and I am here on the Sea Islands. We literally live in the ocean. And just like an ocean wave, no two are alike. But when they come in, they look beautiful coming in, but they always take something back out with them. And so this is the same way that policies can be. They can come in and they may flood over the traditions and the culture and the communities and the sacred spaces and take out what is there that's vital to our continued existence and definitely the continued existence of our cultural heritage. So that is why it is critical, as the chairwoman said, for us as Indigenous people that are coastal people, to be there at the table. As our Minister of Information for the Gullah Geechee Nation often says, if we are not at the table, be on the menu. So as much as we love to go to the ocean, and people love Phnom seafood, they love eating seafood from this region, we don't want to be what's eaten, and we don't want our culture to just be eaten up by other cultures coming in and superimposing their vision for our future onto us like a wave that's coming in, throwing in things and pulling out that which is sacred. So it's critical that we are there throughout the entire process, from the beginning of the time that it becomes a vision to the time that it becomes a policy that now will govern a space and a place that we see ourselves as stewards of instead of owners of.
Thank you, Queen, for that answer. I really like the emphasis on the cultural connections to the ocean, and that policy can come in like a wave and overwhelm communities. Sophia or Nisreen, would you care to build on this question about why it's important to build inclusion, equity, and justice into global ocean policy?
Sure, I can jump in. I mean, I think it's really important to note that tribes and indigenous communities, there's so much more than just another stakeholder group, but they have unique and important legal and cultural status. And so that really guarantees that they need a seat at the table, and they need additional engagement beyond the typical stakeholder engagement process. And indigenous people really rely on the oceans to be able to continue their sustainable livelihood. And they've been stewards of the planet, of this earth, and of oceans for far longer than most of us have. And so because of that, I think that it's incredibly crucial to make sure we're making recommendations for an indigenous approach that focuses on inclusion, examining values, adequate representation, and tribal direction and ocean planning and policy are made. Like what was said before, I mean, I think it's important to bring Western science and policy together with traditional knowledge and values from indigenous communities, because we don't want to be speaking over them. We don't want to be doing things that they don't want. It's very important to build together and to work together so that we're achieving this more equitable, sustainable, and inclusive ocean planning process.
Thank you, Sophia, and especially for that emphasis on the difference between Indigenous people as stakeholders and Indigenous people as rights holders. Which this idea that underlies the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is that Indigenous people have inherent rights that are fundamentally different than other populations because of their long-standing historical use and cultural connection to that place, and also for emphasizing that difference between Indigenous people, not just as users, but as active and ongoing stewards throughout history and in the present. Nisreen, did you want to add anything to this question about why inclusion, equity, and justice are important?
Yes, and actually, this answer might answer another question. So maybe someone will ask, what a person from Sudan knows about oceans. I mean, Sudan is a massland, and our own port is towards the Red Sea, and it's a very small shore comparing to other countries. But now we are talking about climate justice and climate change, and this means that if something actually happened in like hundreds of thousands of kilometers or miles away, and we get impacted by it. For example, if the La Nina and the La Nino happened in the ocean, then the lakes area in Uganda, in South Sudan, in the Nile Basin get flooded. If the La Nino happened, then the high area of Ethiopia get flooded, and then both lakes contribute to the Nile that actually reaches Sudan, and then we get flooded by that. If a small littering happened in any point of the ocean, hundreds of miles away, we might someday eat the fish that comes frozen from another country to our country. If anything, and COVID-19 was the perfect proof that if a small thing happened in a country, this small thing can actually happen and infect the whole world. A very small virus started in China. Now look, we are in 2 years of very big spread around the continent and about the world and about the population. And now millions of people have died, and we lost very dear people due at small event happened in China, and this can happen to any point of the oceans. We are no longer speaking about our national or regional issues. We are talking now about international issues. We are talking about saving our planet, and oceans, of course, is a very big organ of this planet. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for emphasizing the importance of looking at ocean issues and climate issues as global issues, and emphasizing the connections between those issues and communities everywhere. I want to take a jump from this question of why these topics are important over to talking a little bit about those international platforms and policy processes. So what platforms, I guess, exist to create global ocean and coastal policy, and how well are these platforms actually doing at ensuring that the voices of Indigenous peoples and local communities are represented in the discussion, and that their needs and perspectives are actually taken into account in the formulation of the policy that ultimately results? And I know that everyone on this panel has some experience in engaging in these international policy fora. So if you want to talk about your own personal experiences of participating in these processes, or your thoughts on what is being done well, or what barriers exist to effective representation, please draw from those personal experiences or talk in a more general way. And so maybe we could go backwards and start with you, Nisreen, because we'll come back to this point about climate change. How well are people being represented in these discussions on climate change at the international level?
Well, it's funny that you mentioned this question, because I'm currently in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt as part of the African Hub for Negotiators, starting the SBs, the subsidiary bodies negotiating of the UNFCCC. And I can tell you that things are not moving as we wanted. not in terms of the negotiations, not in terms of the very weird conditions of the COVID setting, and of course not in terms of representation. A lot of civil society, a lot of indigenous communities are not able to participate in this virtual setting because of lack of access to electricity and lack of access to internet. While infrastructure issues is very much dearly connected to climate justice and very much dearly connected to availability of delivering your voices, and not only your voices but different communities' voices. Now, I can barely say that only developed countries' civil society are very much able to participate fully in the sessions because they have the infrastructure for that. And not only the current situation of the COVID, but other situations also. For example, one of the speakers before me spoke about big waves and floats and something like this. Let's focus on the response of the international community when a catastrophe happens in developed countries, and then compare it to the response of the communities when a catastrophe also happened in developing countries. Let's take Antigua and Barbuda, for example. They almost have hurricanes, nearly every year or every 2 years because of the extreme climate events crises. How are we responding to that? Are the international events that we are having response enough to that? Where is the climate adaptation and building resilience finance that we are talking about? It's not there, and unfortunately, different conferences are not being clear enough in delivering these finances to these countries to build their resilience and to have adaptation plans and adaptation communities in action. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for that answer, and especially, I think this idea that those that are being impacted by climate change and storm events and other sorts of things are those that are not necessarily as able to be present and to participate in the conversation. That seems like a big concern when we're talking about ocean policy, because this may be the same for the creation of marine protected areas or marine spatial planning or other forms of development.
Right.
And from what I'm hearing around the world, it seems like COVID for some organizations has become an opportunity to push things through quicker, as in terms of development processes. Queen, do you want to build on this question?
Sure. I would love to, because you just used the word that I use a different word for. You use the word development, and I developed a term called destructionment, because usually what we've seen in the Gullah Geechee Nation, on these sea islands in particular, from Jacksonville, North Carolina to Jacksonville, Florida, in which we have 5 seasons, one of which is hurricane season. So what my sister just said is personal for me, because what we have witnessed is that there are destructionaires who come in with a lot of money, a lot of financing, and then because they have the ability to build and rebuild over and over, their voice is leveraged in terms of US policy, and then can also impact international policy and where further funding goes, especially when we are talking about ensuring the continuation of coastal communities. And so what tends to happen is that their funding goes toward cost-benefit analysis, and they'll go and put in more money where they think the higher price real estate is, with the devaluation of the cultural communities, which are priceless. I'm a computer scientist and a mathematician. There are no statistical measures that would definitely say that all of our indigenous communities and our values can be calculated. That is priceless. So what needs to change in terms of policy, and an obstacle, is the direction or the lack thereof of funding that comes toward the communities that actually need the funding. The destruction already have their funding. And so why not fund the communities that do not have it? Why not fund those developing locations, developing states, continuing communities like that of mine and the chairwoman that are continuing. We're not developing, we're continuing. But the thing is there's been so much destruction brought in upon us that it has stripped away many of the things that we value and replaced it with other things that are not sustainable. And so one of the good initiatives that I've seen so far is the UN SDG initiatives, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals initiative. But that is in terms of it being a very visionary initiative, a very aggressive initiative to try to combat some of these things. But where's the money coming from and who does it get directed to? And that is an obstacle. That is an impediment to the flow being opened up of the finances to reach the communities where they're really needed so that the cultural communities can sustain themselves and protect themselves and have the things we need in place to be resilient against impacts like hurricanes, against, or hopefully they say there's another pandemic coming as well. How do we definitely have things in place to take care of ourselves? Because what we found is when the storms come, no one else comes to save us. We have to be in position to save ourselves. It's God and us at that moment. And so where is the blessing of the funding so that we can already be in a better position when the next thing comes, like a wave?
Thanks for emphasizing not only some of the challenges, but also the positive potential provided by the Sustainable Development Goals as a different sort of platform that really does emphasize some of those interrelationships between different elements of development, if you will. And also, this it seems like a key challenge for a lot of communities is actually being able to get to the table and influence those decisions so that the funding is also ultimately targeted in their direction. Not only to influence the decisions, but also to take the actions that are occurring on the ground later. Chairwoman, would you like to just build on this question around the global platforms for ocean policy and your personal experiences?
Well, certainly, because within the United Nations, we know that we have the Permanent Forum for Indigenous Peoples' Rights. However, as part of the United States, we have the luxury of being acknowledged by the federal government. However, there are so many countries that even deny the mere existence of their indigenous peoples. So it makes it very difficult for them to have that voice and to be able to be present, be heard, and have consideration. And of course, adding to that is the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous Peoples' Rights, where you have the free, prior, and informed consent. How can you get that from the indigenous peoples if they're not allowed to be at the table because your government does not acknowledge you? Right. And with us, we've paid it forward with the lives of our ancestors, our lands, and our natural resources, and the United States owes us. And while they do a better job than most, they still fail us miserably, as indicated with the Commission on Civil Rights report, Quiet Crisis, and the Supplement of Broken Promises. But that goes back into the funding of the communities that need that support financially when these types of impacts happen due to global warming, climate change, and all of these other non-natural man-made disasters that manifest itself in a natural disaster. What we're also saying is that, with that being said, the United States has significantly been better to people. And if we're able to work with the US, maybe we can provide a model for other countries to be able to use as a template to try to develop their relationships with their indigenous peoples, because the platforms that are here are very difficult because the aspiration is that it's international. But we have to be more than aspirational with these things. We have to have the countries, the participating member countries, commit and pledge to holding each other accountable and holding each other up to fulfilling the promises that they make to each other about us. Because they're talking about us, they're affecting us, but we're not engaged, and we're not at that table having those discussions. So from my standpoint, the platforms The foundations of the platforms are there, but the implementation and the structure of the platforms really need to be fortified with the voices of the Indigenous peoples, because we're the ones who get impacted. Until or unless the member nations decide that they're only going to work with companies who are willing to hear the Indigenous people's voices and respect the rights of Indigenous peoples, we will always have our lands and our resources and our peoples displaced and or disrespected and or exploited, so that the impacts to our Indigenous peoples are going to be felt long and could potentially ruin our societies, not only our resources, but also impact us dramatically where it can kill off our peoples, because not for naught Mayflowers kill.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad to hear, at least, within that, a positive note that the foundation is there, but that the representation really needs to be stronger. And also this emphasis that prior to just even having funding to participate, that there really needs to be a basis in recognition and acknowledgement. That needs to be foundational to these entire processes in order to have people at the table. Sophia, do you care to add anything to this conversation? Sophia, we seem to have you muted.
Whoops. Okay, I fixed it. I love this conversation around representation and what we can do and what different international platforms can do. I know the original question was really asking about what sorts of forums there are to work on international ocean policy. And I mean, I can think of like the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. But I think even within the UN, there are issues with representation. I mean, what I work on is I work on linguistic access and translating climate information into over 100 languages, because the UN only provides their information in the 6 UN languages, and that accounts for less than half of the world's speaking population. And on the subject of climate change, I mean, the 10 countries that are worst affected by climate change, 9 of them are a majority non-English speaking, and yet the primary dialogue we use to talk about issues like climate change and ocean conservation, it is always English, like it is right now. And so I think that there are definitely issues that we can work on in making sure that we're ensuring adequate representation, whether that be looking at gender balance, ensuring Indigenous voices are heard in international discussions, ensuring that we're translating documents so that the maximum number of people can access them. I think a lot of this just all stems back to education and making sure that people are aware of what is happening to them, and they're aware of what they can do about it, and they're also aware of what their government can do about it and how they can lobby their government, and they're also informed on what their local leaders are doing, and if they don't agree with what their local leaders are doing, then they know who to pressure and what they can do about it.
Thanks. And this obviously links back to this earlier comment about free, prior, and informed consent. That without access to the information, which is facilitated, through or for which language is a barrier to that information being shared and that knowledge. So I want to just think forward to these different policies that we've talked about. The Convention on Biological Diversity is something that you brought up. The FAO is another space. The SDGs and other topics that we've talked about earlier. And just ask, all of these documents obviously have very lofty and aspirational principles. And they have recommendations for what should happen on the ground in terms of, ocean action and ocean conservation and climate change and fisheries management. What impacts do these principles and recommendations that are contained in these international policy documents, what impact do they ultimately have for local communities? Are they actually influencing national policies, or providing space or opportunities for communities to step into the conversation? What sorts of successes or shortcomings do you see that exists in real world application? And maybe I'll just go back to you, Sophia, if you have something that you want to add on that topic.
I mean, I think the real issue is that we have all of these international forums for discussions. We're implementing international policy in theory. However, in practice, oftentimes these are kind of toothless agreements. So while there are regulations, there are not people enforcing these regulations. And especially in areas like the areas that are known as areas beyond national jurisdiction, I mean, they're very difficult to manage, and there are very few laws that promote their protection. And even the laws that are in place, they're very weak and they're poorly enforced. And so because of that, that's why we see our oceans being subject to overexploitation, pollution, and habitat degradation. And all of this is really undermining our oceans, because I think that even though international ocean policy is critical and we should continue to work on these intergovernmental agreements, we also need to stress local policy, because it's much easier to fund and much easier to enforce and regulate local policy than it is to give some broad overarching claim, like saying, oh, you all must do this, but then not putting any funding or any like actual support behind those claims.
Exactly.
Yeah, Queen, do you want to jump in and add something to this conversation about the effectiveness of these agreements and these toothless agreements, as Sophia calls them, and whether or not they provide any support for communities or any space for communities?
They provide space. Now, I agree with Sophia that they often do not provide the support that you need, because part of that support, as I've mentioned already, a major part of it is funding, and the aspect that was already mentioned, the education. Because when we are talking about technology, as a scientist myself, I know that that is a major investment that must be made over time in terms of intellectual attainment, as well as the equipment that has to be utilized. So where I say provide space, at least at the level of the UN SDGs, there is a community of action. The Gullah Geechee Nation has been a participant in that because we have our own Ocean Action Plan. We also have our own Gullah Geechee Nation Sustainability Plan. These are things that where we provided them to the U.S. federal government years ago to say we have our own sustainability plan. We didn't get any sources to help. So we had to continue through our own means to participate, and participating on the international level has at least provided international partners and some national partners that say, well, we do have certain resources, whether that's technical assistance, whether that's equipment, and we will try to collaborate with you to try to have funding so that you can implement other parts of the plan. So it created a space at least to be heard, to get in the boat and start rowing instead of just being in the ocean. Tide overflowed us. In this community of ocean action, everyone there lives on an ocean. They live on islands. They live on coastal areas around the world. So they are all faced with similar issues to what we are basically preaching to the choir, one might say, when they're talking. So that passion for what needs to be done and how we can do it collectively is within the group. But there is still a constant process underway of seeking means by which we can finance what's to be done. Because as has been said, when we go to the UN conferences, we go to international conferences, the first thing is, can you get there? Can you afford to be there? If you could fly there as we used to pre-pandemic, when you get there, are you allowed to be in the blue zone or the green zone? Which one do you have the connection that gets you into there? And once you get in there, are you presenting, or are you just a body in the room listening to others? So although you might be in the space, is the space filling with your values? Is it filling with your mores? Is it filling with the design for your community and your culture to continue? And are the resources coming back toward you within that space, or are they being redirected still in the conversation directed by those who are considered the big boys in the room, the ones who are the major world operators within the international arena. And so that still is an issue. So we may now be in the space, but we have to still have resources to continue to have a real serious impact within that space, and to come from that international level back home, literally on the ground, in the water, row back with the boat resources, and then make a difference on the land and on the ocean where we are. And that's what I try to do as much as I can for the Gullah Geechee Nation. But I know well it's no easy task at all.
Right. Again, this idea that these platforms provide space, but not necessarily adequate support for engagement or implementation. I also like this, this point that you brought up about the potential to bring those values and those laws and those policies from the bottom up into the ocean space. And maybe this is a good place to kind of go back to you, Cheryl, because you have a real experience working across all levels. From the local level to the national level within the United States, and to the international level. Is it more powerful to have the values come from these international policies, or is it more powerful to have them come from the bottom up? What do you see as the relationship between these different scales?
It's not a binary choice, whereas it's got to be all of the above, because on a local level, you do have a little bit more hands-on, but that does not influence. And from the macro perspective, on the international scene is where you can actually, your voice carries to protect the voices of the voiceless, that you're able to help to be able to guide the policies to strike that balance. Because again, in the pursuit of one goal, we cannot, destroy or otherwise displace another goal or another priority. Or, when we're looking at renewable energies, it cannot be at the expense to displace Indigenous people's rights or desecrate a sacred site, or destroy and or pollute, our waterways, or stop them from having access to these places of spirituality where you go and you're able to either connect, traditional medicines and or provide ceremony and or provide prayer for your cultural survival and your internal, internal well-being as a Native or Indigenous person. And so when we're looking at, how best does it work, sometimes the state government has to lean on the local government, and sometimes the federal government has to lean on the state government. But ultimately, if the federal government, our United States government, is not doing right by its international partners' standards, then they can influence how the United States acts. And therefore, if the United States is acting well, they too can influence how another player country or member country is acting or treating their Indigenous peoples. And again, it's almost like it all has to, everybody's got to be in. And we know that we have the ability in certain aspects to simply do what we need to, because they have no say in what we do as a sovereign nation within the United States. However, we also know that when it gets right down to it, our sovereignty has been diminished by the United States self-proclamation that we're domestic sovereigns as opposed to full sovereigns. And we try to instill that in our federal partners, but it's an uphill climb, as we've witnessed, because we still do not have full sovereign status the same way as any other sovereign nation that works with the United States. When they give money to other sovereign nations, they give them the money and they don't report back to the United States. What they see is the development of their country, the uplifting of their citizens within their countries, and that is the measure of the investment that the United States made. Unfortunately for tribes, we are treated like parochial wards of the government, and we have to report on it as if we don't know what we're doing, and if we did not have the ability to govern ourselves and to have flourishing cultural and flourishing civilization prior to the establishment of the Great Experiment of America.
Thanks, Cheryl, for really emphasizing that it's not a binary relationship. That at the international scene, I love what you said about representation being important to give voice to the voiceless. And then on the other side, that there's this need for this real local articulation of those ideals that might be contained in international policy. What does culture look like? What does well-being look like? What does sovereignty and autonomy look like? What does self-governance look like in local places? Nazreen, can you jump in here as well and just talk about this idea of successes and shortcomings in the application of these sorts of global policies or documents?
Yes, let's go back a little bit and try to make a small surgery or analytic approach to the issue we are having right now. So there are smaller but many small polluters to the ocean issue, and there are big, but let me say a few, not very a few, but smaller number than the smaller emitters that are hugely impacting and emitting the oceans. And we have governments that are some unfortunately run by the small amount of polluters that pollute bigger amount of liters into the oceans. And these people who are the people who have the money, who have the influence on the government, who actually runs the campaigns for the people they think that they will support their policies. Now we go back to the small scale of individuals who are contributing to the issue of the oceans and think, are the governments or these international communities, laws, regulations, documents, are actually reaching enough to these communities to tell them that you are hurting the oceans and by then you are hurting the environment and by then you are hurting the planet, or not? If yes, then are these governments doing the same by influencing and pushing hard with the regulations and laws to the private sector, people who have money, who are fewer in number, but unfortunately their impact on the oceans is bigger? Are they doing enough or no? As the previous speakers said, we have different phases of governance that are actually impacting or influencing what's happening in the oceans. Unfortunately, also, and I say unfortunately again, any UN convention is not legally binded, is not actually enough to push these policymakers, these country leaders, in order to push their private sector, in order to make better in what they are doing. Also, any speaking about awareness, training, public information access, and so on, without speaking about funds and adequate resources of finance to actually reach these individuals in these countries, specifically the developing countries, also is just an illusion or just a lie. Moreover to all of this, are we speaking about a central document that actually the guarantees that we will secure our oceans? This document does not exist and will never exist because there is much interest and there is a lot of we are talking about billions of dollars here. There is a huge industries that are actually built on using oceans as way of transportation, neglecting that these oceans actually are sources of life to hundreds of millions of people who are actually depending on these oceans. I cannot say that as future generations we did not lose hope and we will not lose hope, but if the war is divided into small battles, then this battle is not a win yet. But also I ensure that by pushing hard and enabling the local communities, the people who actually knows the values of these oceans, who are their life depends on these oceans, have more space, not only just speaking in events like this, but also be part of making the policies and implementing these policies that we make. I'm sure that we will make a big difference. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for really bringing up the private sector in your comments. I think it's something that we haven't addressed as much here. We talk a little bit more about climate policy and conservation policy, but the laws that apply to the private sector sometimes are also voluntary and soft. So, for example, some people will say that the UN Global Compact, which is an agreement that ocean-focused corporations can sign on to, that it really doesn't go far enough. It's a soft law, and it actually only sets a very low bar and low foundation for corporations, and doesn't really provide any space for communities to come into the conversation. Cheryl, I see you're nodding along with that. So did you want to add something quickly on that?
Absolutely. We have, we call it throughout some of the other work that I did, they'd rather ask forgiveness than permission, because the laws are so soft and without any real consequence. They just as soon break them, because what's the harm? We get what we want as the industry or as that private sector business. They get their revenue, they get their business, and yet they destroy everything in its wake. But the fine that they would pay, if they're paying anything, is so minimal to their profits. It's almost like, why even bother with some of these things? And that's why having policies and or voluntary things that are more aspirational than practical, with some real teeth and consequences to them, really is giving lip service, saying that they're hearing what we're saying, saying that they want to do something, but wanting to do something and actually taking those action steps and putting meat and teeth behind those laws or those policies is what has been missing, and why we continue to be having these same conversations decade after decade.
That's right.
Thanks for building on the previous speaker's comments. And I also want to note that Nisreen really emphasized this idea of hope. And that there is hope. The next generation has hope. And so, in our last 5 minutes, because we only have 5 minutes left in this panel, I want to come to this idea of hope, and think a little bit about, from your personal perspectives, what suggestions would you make to improve these international ocean policy processes? What improvements would you make to ocean policy recommendations or to the application of those principles to ensure that Indigenous peoples and local communities are included and accounted for in ocean conservation? What actions are needed now and in the long term? And so we've got about 4 minutes left, so just take about 1 minute each to make your closing arguments, I guess. Nisreen, as you brought up the idea of hope, let's start with you.
Well, our youth advisory group to the Secretary General is one of the things that always bring hope to my heart. When I see how different we are, different backgrounds and different specialties, and how we all agree on one case, which is the climate justice, and how the young people around the world are striking every Friday, others are growing hundreds of billions of trees. Everyone is trying as their best as they can to make an impact to this environment, to this situation. This brings a very big hope to my heart. One last note before I finish. I just want, I always try to make the government and the policymakers that sometimes they take their own fingers and put it in their eyes and ruin their eyes, because if they did not push enough to the private sector and to the leader who actually destroy the environment, another catastrophe, environmental catastrophe, and we all know that nature bounce back very hard and very strong, and then they will have to deal with the impacts of the catastrophe that they actually brought in the first place. So when we always remind them that they started this, they think by far more before they do anything next time. Thank you very much.
Sophia, please jump in.
I'm very hopeful just by listening to everyone that has spoken today, and also with the young people that I work with every single day, because I really do believe that this generation is going to bring about progressive change. And I think a lot of it does come from representation. So creating new advisory councils that ensure that Indigenous people, young people, women, children, we have a voice in these international discussions, and that we have meaningful representation at tables where decisions are being made.
Thank you. I feel hope listening to the two of you, and I'm really glad that you are so incredibly engaged in these global conversations. Queen Quet, please jump in on your suggestions to improve these processes.
Surely. We have a Gullah Geechee proverb, the water to bring we, the water going to take we back. And I would say to you, it's not time back, though. It's time to act. And in that acting, I would say to add to all these, whether they are at the international, the congressional, the state, the local levels, that what needs to be added is Indigenous implementation funds, that every policy has to have a group of people who are native to that place and that space, that are a team that will be the task that goes forth with the implementation of the plan, and they take the lead instead of others leading us to the destruction. Let's lead to this place and this space where water can bring we, water going to take we back, and it'll be a healthy water, a healthy ocean, and thereby be healthy communities. So thank you for having me as part of this, and I'm looking forward to implementation of some positive plans.
Thank you. Cheryl, do you want to provide some final thoughts? And we've been given a couple more minutes to, if we need them, so please feel free to take your time.
Sure. Well, actually, my hope is, as you can see, I'm the only one with all the gray hair. My hope is all of you young people that are here and fighting this fight. You know, EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, is new. It's one of the newer agencies within the federal system, and it took how long for the United States to recognize, you know, what we're doing to our own environment, and finally starting to make those changes. And the oceans connect us all. That makes us, you know, that is our binding aspect of all of us. No matter where we're at, the oceans have connected us and will continue to connect us. And they are our sources of strength and our sources of sustenance. And we are inextricably connected to the most largest of the mammals, to the smallest of the macroinvertebrates. They are our brothers and sisters, and our Mother Earth provides for all of us. And the foundations are there, but it's up to each and every one of us to continue to move this conversation and move the actions forward. You know, we need to stand to be heard, and we need to continue to educate and do our part to make sure that everybody knows. But we're seeing that movement. It might be slow and it might take a long time, but we didn't get here overnight. So it's going to take us time, hopefully not nearly as much time, to change the course and to make sure that we are doing the right thing by our oceans, but also engaging with our Indigenous peoples, because our traditional cultural practices are what kept our planet and our Mother Earth and our oceans the way they were, sustaining all of us since time immemorial. And it takes that Indigenous, that ancient knowledge of being stewards of our Mother Earth to bring it back to where it needs to be. So I applaud you all, and you're the great work that you're all doing. And thank you. I'm honored to be part of this.
Thanks to all of the speakers for an incredibly insightful panel. I think there's three big takeaway messages here that just to emphasize the this real importance of recognizing and ensuring strong representation of Indigenous people and local communities in these international and national policy discussions. The second one is just the importance of that organizations and governments who are working in the ocean space on the ground, that they are accounting for the voices, the rights, and the needs of Indigenous people and local communities in their deliberations and in the actions that they are promoting and the actions that they are taking. And then the final one that I think kind of touches on, that everybody's touched on in their points, is just around the need for real support, financial support, and otherwise, to ensure that that involvement is possible, and also to ensure that Indigenous people and local communities can be the implementers on the ground of those actions in different places around the world. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for participating and for listening. Feel free to reach out to any of the speakers on this panel with your additional questions or comments. And with that, I'll close the panel. Thank you very much to the entire panel of speakers.
Peace and blessings all.
Everyone.